Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I am again joined by Keith Preston and Derrick Jensen. This is sort of the accumulated thought of various streams and private discussions where we all sort of acknowledge the fact that all too often people on certain ideological sides of the spectrum won't talk to somebody else just because they're icky, even if they might have some overlapping interests and goals. And I think the one who's probably thought the most about this is you, Keith Preston. So if you could give a brief explanation of your idea of pan-anarchism, that'd be great.
Well, without being too long-winded about it, I come from an anarchist background and have been an anarchist for well over 30 years now. And about 20 years ago, I started developing this idea called pan-anarchism, which is really just an umbrella for anti-authoritarian movements on a general level. But on a pragmatic level, it's more about trying to transcend all of the usual boundaries that divide people up ideologically and culturally and things like that. And there were a lot of things that got me interested in this question. But one thing that really sort of was pivotal was back in the anti-globalization era, back 20 years ago, the Battle of Seattle and all that kind of stuff. I started noticing around that time, and maybe a little before that, that there were so many people who had so many of the same ideas and yet hated each other's guts because they had profound cultural differences or more abstract philosophical differences. Even if they had so many of the same common interests in terms of being opposed to globalization or being opposed to global capitalism or neoliberalism or being concerned about the environment or the excesses of the state or all these other factors that people all across the political spectrum are often concerned about. So I created a website called attackthesystem.com years ago, decades ago, for the purpose of bridging some of these gaps. And I've been able to facilitate some conversations along those lines, as well as I've gotten a lot of brickbats thrown back at me as well for doing this. But that's in a nutshell is what pan-anarchism is. It's sort of a pan-anti-authoritarian philosophy. It's about bridging these kinds of, or at least working around these kinds of cultural and philosophical differences.
Yeah, exactly. One of the elements that for me I've been thinking about is it's often easier. Well, first of all, people on different sides of the ideological spectrum don't always realize that there are people who have at least similar values, if not similar presuppositions. So, for example, in the discussion we had a couple months ago, Derrick, you mentioned hunters and small-scale loggers versus the big industries, and you and they had a similar hostility to the larger industries. And a lot of times people just can't look beyond the immediate. And in the long run, that's sad because on the one hand, you could achieve some of what you want. It's easier to convince somebody that they already agree with you on point X rather than have them reinvent themselves overnight. But then also on a more pragmatic level, if people lose the ability to talk to each other and work out differences like this, then they just end up shooting each other. And that's how we get to civil wars and things like that. And so I think we've all sort of thought about this in our own way. So what are some of your thoughts on this problem, Derrick?
Well, I think it's hugely important. And I mean, the first thing I think of when I think of what you said about pan-anarchism is I think about Tecumseh's idea of pan-Indianism back in the a couple hundred years ago, where he went around trying to get recognizing that the various nations had a common enemy, which was the settlers, and trying to get them to work together to fight off that threat. And it didn't work particularly well. He was able to put together some sort of confederation, but as often as not, he would go to visit some people and they would say, no, we've hated you forever and we still hate you and we'll let you walk off our land. But other than that, we're going to kill you if you don't leave immediately. And then last time when I was on about the Christians, we talked about the Homoousians and the Homoousians fighting each other. And I mean, so it's not just a problem. And now we move to anarchism. And, my own experience of this is that, I mean, 20 years ago, I would have had a different perspective on this than I do now. And I completely agree and support your idea, and I think it's a fabulous idea. And my particular experience of this is that, you know, I have had anarchists threaten to kill me. Anarchists have assaulted my friends. Anarchists have spat in the face of my friends. Anarchists have attempted to destroy my career. They have gotten me deplatformed. The last time I was in a room with a number of anarchists, they were bellowing that I'm a Nazi. So I think it's a great idea. Well, I want to bring a couple more things to the table on this. One of them is that, did we talk about that book on his assassinations that I read a while ago, last time I was on?
I don't think so.
Okay, so I read a book on a history of assassinations maybe 20 years ago. And one of the things I got out of it was that assassins traditionally have not been very reliable. Like the assassins for the KGB, the CIA, whatever. And one reason they're not reliable is because you have to be kind of crazy you have to be a fanatic to want to kill somebody. And the guy's point was that fanatics generically, or probabilistically, I should say, have a higher rate of being mentally unstable. And this would be true whether they are a fanatic for the Oakland Raiders or LA Raiders or whatever, Las Vegas Raiders, whatever they are now, or whether you're a fanatic for anarchism, a fanatic for Christianity, a fanatic for, it doesn't matter. Chances are good you might. Another way to say this is that Joseph Campbell talked about, for those in whom a local mythology still works, there exists a path before you. So if Catholicism works for you, you've got a path set out before you that has thousands of years of meaning associated with it. But if it doesn't work for you, and the other, or capitalism doesn't work for you, whatever the social meaning makers are don't work for you, you have to set out on your own to make meaning. And that's a very difficult path. And a lot of the people who are spun out are going to be abnormal. And I'm meaning this value neutrally. And the problem comes that I mean, I'm sure you've all experienced this too. There's a lot of crazies in anarchism, and it's
hazardous to your health.
This is not a problem with anarchism. Okay, here's the deal: is that I used to ask people at talks, and there's 10,000 people, 20,000 people total. I've asked this question: do you believe that the government takes better care of human beings or corporations? Everybody says better care of corporations. Everybody knows this. So the next question is, why aren't all these people anarchists? Because there are a lot of people who really understand that that anarchism, I mean, the governments are made by and for the wealthy. I'm gonna say one more thing and then I'm gonna shut up. That I have a book, I don't have a book out. I have a book I've written that has gotten me blacklisted that talks about a war for the soul of anarchism between those who understand that governments are made by and for those in power and primarily serve those in power on one hand, and on the other hand, you have people who believe that because governments are by and for those in power, therefore all social restrictions of any sort are inherently oppressive and must be done away with. And you get those anarchists pushing for, and I'm not making this up, pedophilia, bestiality, treating each other like crap. And I mean, and this is a problem that goes back a while, that if you have a fundamentally anti-authoritarian ideology and you're a decent person, it's like the best ideology around. But if you're if you have an anti-authoritarian, but at the same time, unfortunately, a lot of sociopaths will be attracted to an anti-authoritarian ideology, because they're going to say nobody gets to tell me what to do, and I don't want any social restrictions on my behavior. And I'm looking at you, Max Stirner. So okay, I'm done rambling. So take.
No, yeah, I think one of the interesting points here is that it's not only a difficulty of working together across the aisle, it's even difficult working together within the pews, because people who, you know, are under the same flag can't seem to get, they seem to hate each other as much as they hate somebody across the aisle.
I used to love Nestor Makhno because, you know, he fought the whites, he fought the reds. This is in Russia, in Ukraine. He fought the whites, he fought the reds, he fought the whites, he fought the reds. And then I learned that he also called in other anarchists under a flag of truce and shot them. I was like, what the hell, dude? So at that point, my respect for Nestor Makhno went way down. So it's just like, anyway, sorry, go ahead.
No, yeah, but I think we also hinted at, well, we've all sort of hinted at this in various streams, but part of the problem is there is a breakdown in people's ability to have a sort of shared common sense of the good. So for example, 100 years ago, right around the Great War starting, you had Catholics and Orthodox and Protestants all over Europe and North America. And they had, you know, their theological debates, but they all had the same moral framework. And they all could sort of get along, sort of. And after World War I, for various reasons that we don't need to get into now, Christianity becomes discredited. And you have different ideologies: communism, fascism, anarchism, National Socialism, you know, neoliberalism, the whole 9 yards. And everybody starts fragmenting because they're not just disagreeing about doctrines, they're disagreeing about the fundamental aspect of reality. And what's interesting is with the rise of corporations and corporatism, back in the day, if you needed something done, you couldn't all do it yourself. You had to work together. So your neighbor down the street who was a wheelwright and you just broke your wagon, you couldn't, you know, tick him off because he might not want to help you out when your wagon broke. And if you know a farmer down the road and you need food, you don't want to tick him off. So you've all got to learn to work together. But with the modern corporate state, we can all just sort of say, no, you bug me. I don't need to hang out with you anymore. And I'll just, you know, go to Amazon. And so what ends up happening is that because of the market system, we can all sort of basically treat political philosophy and religion as a video game. It has no consequences. And we just all hyper diversify, hyper disintegrate. And so now we're what we might call hyper disintegration, where almost none of us have common values anymore, even within the same movement, waving the same flag. What are some of your thoughts on that, Keith?
Well, I would say that my experiences with the anarchist milieu, at least in North America, have been virtually identical to what Derrick just described. Now, he's probably had more experience with that than I have because he's more accomplished and more well-known. But, you know, my experience is certainly a microcosm of what he just described. And I know other people who had the same experience. I know people that I correspond with that they tell me that by mentioning my name to someone, they got a death threat or something like that. Well, if you know that guy, I want to kill you. And I think, though, that this kind of extreme sectarianism or fanaticism that you see among anarchists and among some other ideologies as well is exactly rooted as well in what Derrick was talking about, in the sense that I think that a problem that fringe movements have of any kind, it doesn't even matter what the philosophy is, but if it's something that's socially marginal, you know, whether it's socially marginal for good reason or bad reason, but just because it is socially marginal, by nature, it tends to attract a lot of people that really just aren't functional people. And I think the reason for that is you have people that I suspect that in any kind of society or in many kinds of societies would be losers or dysfunctional people, you know, people that have antisocial personality disorder or something wrong with them. And people like that, by definition, drift towards other marginal people who are also rejected by the wider society. And I think in anarchism, what Derrick is saying is exactly right, in the sense that you have this stereotypical image of what anarchism is, which is this kind of antisocial, you know, do your own thing, promote chaos type of philosophy, the way it's depicted and caricatured. And then there are people who are drawn to it precisely for that reason. The caricature is what they're drawn to. there was actually an Italian anarchist decades ago, I guess in the early 20th century, Luigi Fabrigi, I believe was his name. I may be mispronouncing the name, but he had a book called Bourgeois Influences on Anarchism. And what he basically said is this. He said, in the press, in the bourgeois press, we anarchists are depicted as this. And for that reason, we attract a lot of people in our milieu who want to be that, who want to be what our enemies say we are. You know, our enemies say we're terrorists, nihilists, you know, criminals, lunatics, sociopaths, or whatever the term for that would have been back then. And you have people who are all those things who come to our milieu and say, yeah, sign me up, you know. And I do think that that's a problem among a lot of, you know, I would say not just among anarchists, but among radicals and fringe political movements and fringe cultural movements on a general level. You know, I've had interactions with people on the far right, you know, the 3%er and militia and conspiracy theory and sovereign citizen and all that kind of stuff too. And while I've never really been a part of that kind of thing directly, I see a lot of similar personality traits and personality types, and I've seen it in fringe religious circles as well. And so it's just something about, you know, being on the margins will attract marginalized people. You know, and while maybe some of these people are marginalized unfairly, maybe some of them are not marginalized unfairly. And I think that's really where the problem comes in. And I think back to your point, Todd, about, you know, conflicting worldviews. Yeah, I think that some of this is existential because people have totally different views of what the basis of life is. You know, with them, like, you know, like if you share a common religious heritage, for example, if you're a Protestant, Catholic, maybe Jewish, maybe Islamic, you know, depending on how sectarian you get, you have this basic kind of monotheistic, Abrahamic tradition that you all hold to. Or on the left, you know, we did a podcast just a couple of days ago, Todd and I and some other fellows, where we were talking about how a fellow I once knew who was an anarchist, but then he was saying that anarchists, you know, had a common culture with Stalinists, you know, because, well, we're rationalists and we're products of the Enlightenment or something like that, you know, as opposed to, say, National Socialists, you know, even though Stalinists and National Socialists actually create very similar systems in practice. So, but you do have this underlying, you know, view of what you think the metaphysical structure of reality is. And also, I think a bigger thing than that, though, is the kind of moral sentiments that people have. And this is where my Nietzschean influences, I suppose, come into being. You know, but Nietzsche had the idea that the left, as it was developing in his time in the 19th century, he argued was a kind of secularized Christianity. Now, he was opposed to this. He was very critical of this. But he was saying the bottom line is the left, you know, I mean, obviously I'm paraphrasing what he actually said, but he said, the left is really just Christianity without Christ. You know, it's really just the same kind of slave morality. The least shall be the first. The bottom shall be, those on the bottom shall be exalted. But of course, what he was in champion of is, you know, he was in favor of what he called master morality, the idea of, you know, power is good. You know, it's more of a, you know, I mean, he cited as his heroes Julius Caesar, Napoleon, and Alexander, and figures like that. But you know, now whatever you think of Nietzsche's of the direction he took it in, I think that he was right in the sense that among people on the left end of the spectrum, you have this kind of moral outlook that it's rooted in other things, I think. But it's but they seem to have this idea that people who don't share a lot of their moral premises are somehow unclean. You know, it's this idea, like, for example, I've had conversations with anarchists from the left, and I'll say, well, look, you guys go out and you march hand in hand with these Stalinists and Trotskyites, and because you're protesting against racism or police brutality or something like that. Have you ever talked to any of these patriot militia people? Because they have a lot of the same anti-government views or anti-police views or anti-something else views. And they say, well, no, we can't talk to them because they're right-wingers, you know, or they're whatever they are. There's always something they are. They're racist, or they're xenophobic or homophobic or, you know, agoraphobic or something, you know. But there's some reason why these people are unclean and they can't be interacted with because we might be contaminated. You know, even though they're out there with people whose own traditions involve shooting people in their own community. So it's just a very it's a lot of disconnect with this kind of stuff that I've experienced.
Yeah, Derrick, what are some of your observations on this?
Well, I love everything you're saying. It's so great. I was given, I hate to say this, and I hope you don't take this the wrong way, but given my given what I said earlier about the death threats and everything else from the anarchists, I was a little bit nervous about this conversation because I didn't know how it was going to go. But everything you're saying is great. This is all, and the thing I want to say about the most recent thing you said is a friend of mine calls that the cooties theory of politics, where if I talk to the wrong person, I get cooties, and then you can't talk to me because then you'll get the cooties that I got from that person, and then nobody can talk to you because you got cooties from me who got it from that person, and it's just nuts. And then I want to say another thing, a story that a friend of mine from West Virginia told me several years ago. I was complaining about, this was when the attacks by the anarchists on me were fairly new, and I was complaining to a friend about it and saying, does this happen in right-wing movements too? And the guy's from West Virginia. He told me this funny story about a KKK movement or KKK chapter in his small town that consisted of 3 brothers. And about 2 years later, the town had 3 KKK chapters, each one consisting of one of those brothers, and they all hated each other.
Yeah,
I got one, just to interject here. Todd may appreciate this because he's such a strong Protestant. But when I was a kid, for a time, my family belonged to a very conservative Calvinist church that had, it met in the basement of a house, and it had 23 people who were considered legitimate communicant members. That is, people who could take the communion or the Eucharist, depending on what kind of Christian you are and whatever you call it. But then this church actually split down the middle because there was this one man in the church that he had 4 children in their teens that he wanted them to become full-fledged communicant members. And then the pastor said, no, I don't think they're ready for this. I don't think they're committed enough to this. So he said, well, forget you. And he went and started his own church. He went and bought a church building, right? He could do that because he was rich. But so he bought his own church building and then installed his oldest son, who was something like 19 years old, who wasn't even an ordained pastor, installed him as the pastor and said, okay, well, I've got my new church and I'm going to do things my way. And he took a few of the other church members with him at that point, so instead of like 23 members, we had, 16 or something left, so we could get some more.
Well, one of the elements about, again, even this lack of common ground, even amongst people under the same flag. Well, what do you think, Derrick, now about bioregionalism being called eco-fascism? Like Naomi Klein made those attacks on eco-fascism and other groups.
I hadn't heard that she said that, but it doesn't really surprise me. Can you make the case? Can you put yourself in their head and make the case for me in a couple sentences as to why bioregionalism is eco-fascism?
Literally, the only reason is because the Christchurch shooter and another shooter had it in their manifesto. That's it.
Cooties. It's cooties again. Exactly.
It's just the cootie theory. So Derrick, you're a fascist now.
Oh, I've been a fascist for a long time. Don't worry. I've been an eco-fascist from the globalists, and then I'm a Nazi from the anarchists, and it's I don't know. I want to say something about that, and stop me if I said this in the last time we talked. So I think this is really important. I say it as often as I can, that I was friends for a long time, and we're still friends. We just don't talk very much. Jeanette Armstrong, she's an Okanagan Indian writer and activist. And one time she said to me, we Okanagans have the same problems that white people do. We get mad at each other. We hate each other. But there's a big difference in that we recognize that we have to, my great-grandchildren might marry your great-grandchildren. It's what you're saying about community where, having to work with the wheelwright as opposed to just buying on Amazon. So we recognize we have to get along because we're not moving anywhere. And they themselves have a conflict resolution method in their community that they want to propagate. and it's called the Enowkin process, EN''OWKIN. And what it literally means, is popping the top of your head off and putting something in. But what it means in practice is I challenge you to give me your most opposite perspective to mine so I can increase my understanding. And it's a beautiful, beautiful process. But she said it's really important that the process can only be used by two people or by two groups who are working in good faith. Because if it's used by an abuser, it's used by somebody who wants to take what you have, then you can't, they can misuse the process. So they also, it's not just really, oh, this is all so sweet, we all get along. There are very hard-headed rules about it, including recognition that sometimes the other person wants to take something from you, and you don't do this sort of mediation. But I think this sort of thinking is really important to, just let me hear your beef, and then I'll tell you what I'm thinking about it, and it may end up that we can't work together.
Well, you see, I actually really like that perspective because, I'm 32, and looking back at how there's a lot of people that I thought were acting in good faith but weren't. But that was always sort of what I thought you should do to somebody. It's like, okay, tell me the best case you have, and here's the best case I have, and let's, at the very least, figure out where we stand. If not, change each other's opinion. It does work, but you have to find the right kind of people. And I think one thing to jump off of what you just said, Derrick, is that it's hard because people then call you mean, and no one likes to be considered mean. But you've got to be aware of the danger signs, if you will, of bad actors, and just shut it down. Just don't talk to them. Don't dignify them with a conversation.
So I have a question for both of you. I feel like, okay, so what do we do? Okay, anarchism, I mean, this was supposed to be about pan-anarchism, and anarchism is in many ways an open membership. Somebody becomes an anarchist by saying they are. I mean, you don't have to go through, even though, of course, I'm sure you have too. I've gotten in much trouble because I've written things that I didn't send past the Anarchist Central Committee first. But leaving that aside, what do we do as a movement? I mean, I'm completely with you. I would love it if we could have sort of a pan-anarchism movement, but what do you do with the crazies? And this is a problem that goes back in anarchism. Severino di Giovanni wanted to set off some bombs in South America, and the anarchists argued about it. And then what do you know? One of the people who was arguing against him setting off bombs got murdered, and guess who did it? It was Severino, our pal. And so, or the illegalists, where they killed a lot of people, including anarchists that disagreed with them. So, what do we do? How do we make this? And how do we don't have the same situation as the Okinawans, where we're not going to be living in the same spot forever. So how do we, in your perspective, Keith, how do we create this, and how do we deal with the sociopaths who, I'm going to say one more thing after this. How do we deal with the sociopaths who are attracted to this ideology? And one of the things I've been saying for a long time about this is, if the anarchists can't drive the sociopaths out of anarchism, how will they ever drive them out of capitalism, where they're actually getting monetarily rewarded and they have guns and tanks and airplanes? Okay, I'm done rambling.
Well, I can describe how I've approached this personally and what has worked and what hasn't worked, and I can describe ideas that others have, but much of my activism around this has been online rather than forming organized groups. And organizing online, perhaps, many people would say, well, that's kind of a cop-out because you're not really doing anything. You're just creating echo chambers and things like that. But I know for a while, I've been banned from Facebook now, but for a while I had a couple of Facebook pages that had thousands of people on them, and they were open public forums. Anybody could join or at least read my Facebook page or be on my friends list. and most of them were people from fringe movements of different kinds, far left, far right, and a lot of my Facebook threads looked like WWE battle royals between leftists and Nazis, and or the different kinds of categories. Eventually Facebook got onto that and told me no more, or just got rid of me. But what I have found is that the general public projects that I have done are just that. They're open to the general public. So I pretty much let anybody participate in forums online or chat discussions, or, even people that have really vile opinions, even people who are really rude and discourteous to other people. And I do that in the name of free speech and, opposing the whole council culture and deplatforming ethos and all that. But when it comes to stuff that's more serious, I've always been much more selective about the kinds of people that I associate with. For instance, I have, a website that I have other people who are co-editors, so they actually have access to the website where they can go in and be editors. Well, I don't give access to that to anyone that I don't think is a trustworthy person, who's not somebody I've known for a while and demonstrated repeatedly that they do solid work and stuff like that. I go by their track record. So it's a much closer circle. In some political circles that I've been a part of, I have banned people from the circle, and usually it's been for non-political reasons, like a couple of guys who were stalking female members of the circle, that kind of behavior. And then there was this one guy who was just really outlandishly racist and insulting other people, and I had to get rid of him. So I think that it's some way. I've always said that this is sort of a multi-layered approach or maybe it's kind of like the onion, where you have all the different layers of the onion, and that on the outer layers you can have all sorts of contaminants, but when you start getting into the core, it's got to be a little bit cleaner. And that's generally what, and I've always kept my groups informal. Like, I've never tried to found an organization that says, okay, we're going to have a committee of, executive committee and treasurer and vice president, all these kinds of things, because I think that when that kind of stuff is created, obviously we have to have organization for certain things, but the more formal your group gets, the more problematic it gets in terms of power struggles and that kind of stuff. I tend to be big on organizing small groups of people who know each other, who are competent, who have proven track records, who trust each other for particular projects. Get this particular project done, whether it's running a website or whether it's building a co-op or whatever it is somebody wants to do, an intentional community. Now, in terms of translating that out into the wider society, I'm interested in things. I don't actually live in one, but I'm interested in intentional communities and intentional societies and startup societies. And probably I got this idea from reading too much when I was a child about the early American colonies, and then as a 20-something anarchist reading about the utopian colonies from the 19th century. But the idea that I'm really interested in, the idea of creating alternative model societies, whether it's intentional communities or dual power structures or agorism, counter economics. But I think that of all the projects like that I've looked at, the ones that tend to be successful are the ones that do have some means of screening the people who participate. There's a commune about 100 miles from me that's been around for 40 years and continues to be very successful. They keep their population at about 100 people, and not just anybody is accepted there. Somebody that comes in there is sort of on probation until they show that they're a worthwhile member of the community. And I'm sure they've had people they've had to ask to leave for being problematic. Whereas I've come across other anarchists or radical or just whatever intentional communities that had let anybody that wanted to show up, like squats. So basically what you get is a building, an abandoned building full of junkies and all of that. Maybe junkies need a place to go too, but it's if you're really trying to build any kind of project that's going to have any kind of quality to it, I think well, I've said before, I'd rather have 5 quality people than 500 low quality people. 500 low quality people is fine for a Facebook discussion group, but if you're trying to do some kind of serious project, I think the people you're working with have to be people who know and trust each other and have proven track records. In fact, there's an organization that I'm interested in. It's called Startup Societies Foundation. I don't belong to it personally, so I don't speak for them. But I've noticed that they have these ideas, these guidelines on what they consider to be a legitimate startup society or intentional community. And it comes down to very basic things. Well, we don't really want us to be associated with death cults like Charles Manson or, Jim Jones, and we don't want to be involved with actual terrorist groups, and we don't want to be involved with organized crime groups or somebody that wants to set up an intentional society to facilitate human trafficking or something like that. And this is basic common sense ideas. These aren't authoritarian ideas. This is just basically, we don't want people who are more trouble than they're worth, or people who are going to bring down the wrath of the state or whatever. So I think it's possible to create some very basic guidelines or norms that can control these kinds of things, depending on the context. And I think the more serious your project is, the bigger your project is, the tighter the norms have to be. If it's just, let's all sit in a circle and discuss anarchism, okay, well, whoever wants to can show up. But if we're going to actually build some kind of community, then yeah, it's got to become some kind of way of screening people or vetting people.
Derrick, one of the things as well is, I think a lot of times people don't really know what to look for in a bad actor. They just kind of naively assume that most people they're going to engage with are going to engage in good faith. You even in a homogeneous society like the Indian tribe you just mentioned, that you can't necessarily even assume that. So it's not just a problem of diversity per se, though we can argue about how much it affects it. But even in homogeneous societies, you'll see that. And so you need to first identify who these bad actors are. So like in a small town, there used to be like this, the idea that, oh, so-and-so is a troublemaker. Just don't deal with so-and-so, keep them at arm's distance, and once you sort of have that reputation and people in a group that has enough of a critical mass to be self-perpetuating, they just look for that. But also look for people that really are the good actors. And then try to reach out to them and say, okay, we all are honest, upfront people, and we have some of these values in common. Let's start with that. And then, of course, you can't get into the club, quote unquote, if you're a bad actor. And we vet. Vetting has almost been forgotten, and I think that's a big problem because you need to do a lot of vetting. And so I think that is a big issue there. So what are some of your thoughts on what you've heard, Derrick?
I think it's all great, and I have a couple of examples. I think it's absolutely right on, and including recognizing the bad apples, because my experience is that, and I've worked with a fair number of sociopaths, both when I used to teach at a prison and just in the culture at large, and I watched Breaking Bad last year, which I hadn't seen up until then, and I didn't like it much on one level because the character Walter White was such a jerk. I just hated him. But something they did a brilliant job of is he destroyed everything he touched. He destroyed the big meth empires. He destroyed his family. He destroyed his wife's sister's family. He destroyed Saul Goodman's life. He destroyed the rich, he destroyed everybody. And there were probably, once I caught on to the pattern, I probably saw 5 or 6 different speeches that they had characters in the movie saying, you destroy everything you touch. Like 6 different characters, 4 or 5 different characters said the exact same speech. It's like, hey, we want to make this really clear. Okay, so that's one thing. Next thing is, when I used to teach at the prison, it was a supermax, one of the questions I asked one person, this person was he had been a mule, bringing stuff up from Mexico, bringing drugs up from Mexico. I said, how did you know whom to trust? And because you're not doing it by yourself. And he said, oh, it was somebody from the village, somebody I'd known since I was 2 years old. And then the next thing is, I had a couple surgeries done at Scripps Green Hospital, I think it's called, Scripps Green Clinic. And it was remarkable. When I was there, it had an institutional personality where everybody was really nice. And even the janitors, you're wheeling your wheelchair down the hall, and the janitor's like, how you doing today, sir? Everybody's nice. And I've also been in hospitals where some of the people are nice, but frankly, a lot of them are just are kind of mean. And it got me thinking about institutional personality. And then I happened to be in a situation where I could talk to the overall personnel manager for the company Patagonia. And it's like, okay, I've got a human rights manager. I can ask them this question. How do you get an institutional personality? How does that, and I mean, if I ask that, if somebody asked that of me, it's like, I got no idea, but that's what this person's job is. I said, how do you do it? They said, oh, it has nothing to do with the company later. It's everything to do with the interviews. It's when you do the initial interview with the people, you choose the ones who are going to be, they might not be the best qualified in terms of they might not have the schooling, the experience, but if they're a good human being, bring them in. So I'm just validating everything both of you said.
One thing that I think is extremely important to discuss why these, for lack of a better word, anti-authoritarian groups can't seem to get along is I think there's this idea, especially but not exclusive to anarchists, that their particular view of the way the world should be would be everywhere if we just got rid of capitalism, if we just got rid of the state. It'd be everywhere. But it can't be everywhere because the homogeneous cultures of the kind they're talking about, global ones, are only the result of top-down authoritarian power structures. So they're literally working at cross purposes within their own philosophy. They're like, down with the system. We need to, undermine these authoritarian structures. But then they advocate a future that could only be achieved by totalitarian structures. And it's like, guys, you can never get all that you want ever. There's going to have to be some give and take. It's part of existence. And so I think one of the big problems is a lot of these anti-authoritarians have an authoritarian mindset. So, Keith, what are we thought to you?
Yeah, I've got an anarchist friend who's a fellow I correspond with who started to, he's been involved in the left anarchist activist scene for quite some time, but he's starting to come around to my way of thinking a bit. But he has a phrase for this. He calls it world domination anarchism. And he was like, I just don't get this idea that these folks say they're so anti-authoritarian, but then they have this idea there's going to be this world system that is modeled on their own prescriptions. He said that's basically just imperialism. It's thinking about this question actually was something that got me interested in all of these ideas because I always thought, well, if we did away with authoritarian power structures and hierarchical institutionalized power structures and all the things that anarchists criticize, and people organize themselves on the basis of all these core anarchist principles anarchists claim to uphold, whether it's free association or voluntarism or decentralization or participatory democracy or whatever your model is, it always seemed to me that would expand rather than decrease diversity. And most anarchists claim to be in favor of diversity, but I also think that we create a lot of diversity a lot of anarchists would like. For example, does that mean that people in, say, rural India overnight are going to become LGBT activists? Probably not. Does that mean that people in, say, China are going to become vegetarian? Or vegan? Well, probably not. Instead, you're going to have a huge plethora of cultural groups and social groups and community groups that reflect an infinite variety of value systems. If you for example, I know I was reading about many years ago, I was reading about traditional Chinese culture, and it was talking about the folk religions that you had in China, where they said in one village, you might have one set of ancestral traditions and gods that you worship, and the next village over, you have a totally different set of gods that you worship. So it's like every village has its own religion or its own pantheon. And I tend to think that's more like what anarchism would be in practice. You wouldn't have these, like you have anarchists that write up all these manifestos, and like Derrick was mentioning Machno previously, that's the tradition that platformism comes out of. I'm more on the Volin camp, by the way, when it comes to the platformist rather than the Machno camp. But because I always thought the platformists were kind of like pseudo Bolsheviks or something like that. But it's always seemed to me that with anti-authoritarian values becoming pervasive, then on a cultural level, on a social level, that creates more diversity, but it's a genuine diversity in the sense that it's not necessarily a cosmopolitan diversity. It can be a cosmopolitan diversity, but it can also be all kinds of other things, including in some instances things that are kind of exclusionary, that are suspicious of outsiders and other ways of life and things like that. I think that the kinds of societies that tend to be very cosmopolitan in many ways are imperial societies, because you have people that are forced under the same political roof. I mean, if you look at all the most cosmopolitan societies that have ever existed, what were they? The Roman Empire, the British Empire, America today, the European Union. I mean, that all of these are systems that are imposed from the top down, where those at the top are saying, okay, we're going to have this universal value system, and of course, there's always an element of exploitation that's involved in it. Like for example, one big issue now with a lot of anarchists from the left is the immigrants' rights issue, and without speaking to that issue per se. The Roman Empire was actually in favor of immigration because they wanted to import the Nordic tribes into Rome itself as people they could exploit more easily, and they ended up using them as mercenaries and things like that. So I think that without concentrated power, you get more diversity and you get more multiculturalism, or whatever it be called. But it's not always going to be a cosmopolitan multiculturalism. It's not going to necessarily be a libertarian multiculturalism. You're going to have people that are going to not want to associate with other people and not like other people. In some ways, I think it might be like the early American colonies. You had all these groups coming from Europe that set up their own little utopias in the New World, as they called it, and they all hated each other. I mean, you would be like how many of the Puritan communities would split up and form new communities, and then you couldn't be a Quaker in Puritan Massachusetts, so the Quakers went and they founded Pennsylvania instead, and then the Baptists went and founded Rhode Island, and then the Mormons decades later went and founded Utah. So that when people are left alone to do what they want to do, well, one of the first things they want to do is kick everybody else out.
Before I say anything, I want to acknowledge your skill as a facilitator who says just the right amount of things to spur conversation, and also pushes the little red dot on who talks around very skillfully. So I want to thank you for that. I'm thinking a bunch of things. I'm agreeing with everything you're saying. I think one of the things that we need to recognize is, and I'm not meaning this as a joke at all, is I don't think humans are fundamentally good, and I don't think humans are fundamentally evil. I don't think we're, necessarily, I don't think we're like, I don't believe Richard Dawkins' selfish gene stuff, and there's many other things I don't believe. But one of the things I do believe is that we're fundamentally contentious. And I think the same thing is true for songbirds. I think the same thing is true for dogs, these two dogs love each other very much, and they were just scrapping like 20 minutes before I got on. And I think any social system that wants to last needs to come up with ways to deal with the fact that we're fundamentally contentious. And we like to gossip. We like to argue. I'm not saying everybody likes to argue, but we get in spats, and that's one thing. The next thing is, you both probably know the names on this better than I do, but there were some studies done on the largest population you can have that maintains democratic face-to-face power structures. I believe it's 120 people, somewhere in there. So anytime you are more cosmopolitan, you are by definition going to end up with some authoritarian power structures. And I'm also a big believer in Lewis Mumford's idea that technology leads to certain social forms. And one great example of that is basically Mumford's idea very quickly Mumford's idea on this was that a technology does not emerge from a vacuum, that it arises from and it gives rise to certain social structures. And so certain technologies or techniques, the combination of society and technology, he called it technic. And certain techniques give rise to certain power structures. And if you have mining, for example, you have to have the force to force people into the mine, and then you have to have protect. You have to have a police force to protect the mine door, and then you have to have a police force to protect that other wealth, et cetera, et cetera. And a great example of this was I was talking to a dedicated Marxist. I was being interviewed by a dedicated Marxist, I don't know, 10 years ago, who argued that we can have a cosmopolitan worldwide civilization with purely voluntary economic exchanges at every level with no exploitation. And I said, great, how do you get around in your city? And he said, a bus. I said, great, what's the bus made of? He said, metal. I said, great, where do you get the metal? He said, mines. I said, great, how do you get people into the mines? Because mining, of course, is so miserable. That was one of the first forms of slavery. So you pay them a lot. I said, well, I don't think that's really worked, but I'll give that to you. But every hard rock mine in the world pollutes water. And so what about the people who live on the river? What do you do about them that's now polluted? He said, well, you pay them to move. And I said, well, what if they live there for 5,000 years and they don't want to move? He says, you pay them more. I said, what if their ancestors are there and they refuse to move? He said, well, the 1 million people in the city vote, and they vote that you evict the 400 people from the river. And I said, so I see you've gone from purely voluntary exchanges to democratic empire, land theft from indigenous people, and genocide in less than a minute. Also, you can have a bus. And the point is that I completely agree that a real diversity would be 1 million different cultures, each one arising from its own region, many of whom would be really, I was going to swear, would be really nasty. Many of whom would be really nice. And the ones who are really nice, who happen to be neighbors to the nasty ones, would probably end up getting conquered. And that doesn't alter the fact that there would exist some really nice cultures. And that's just, I'm just throwing all that into the mix, that as soon as we get to another reason that the anarchist project, it's like, okay, I'll just say it. I think Bob Black's an idiot. And in one of his books, he talks about how you clean the sewers in a big city. And he says you do it without having any workerism or whatever he calls it. He says you volunteer. In fact, you have children who like to play around in the muck. These children will like to go around and clean up the sewage system. Okay, so first, how many of these kids are going to die of dysentery? Second, you can't have children running a modern sewage system for a city of New York. I mean, is this just, I mean, so the point is that if you have a city the size of New York, you either A, have to have people pooping in the streets and have people dying of dysentery, or B, you have to have a sewage treatment plant that is designed by engineers, that is run by engineers, that are experts of some sort, and you have to pay people to work with the poop because nobody wants to work with the poop. I mean, nobody's going to go, hey, there's my life's job. I think I want to carry poop around. Nobody does that. So if you have a small group of people, then you can come to, I mean, if a family goes camping, and even if they went camping for a year, a small group would, okay, you know, Junior, this week you have to dig the latrine. Next week, I'm going to dig the latrine. You know, it's like you can parcel things out like that in a fair fashion in a small group. But in a larger group, those principles, I think, are physically impossible, are impossible on any number of levels.
Now, that's a great place, and I'd like to go further with it, but we need to start wrapping it up because we're almost at the end of the hour. So, Keith, I'll give you the first crack at final statements.
Yeah, well, I agree with much of what Derrick just said. As far as Bob Black, he and I were Facebook friends, and he unfriended me. He said I said something intolerable, but then he never told me what it was I said that was intolerable. So I don't know what that happened with that.
Could have been anything.
But yeah, I think a work that I'm very interested in that's come out in recent years is the works of James Scott, who's talked about the rise of modern civilization, well, of civilizations and how they came into being. He talks about the art of not being governed is one of his works, and then Against the Grain. But if we go back and we look at the history of societies and civilizations, we see that this is how they typically start. We see that you have a system of conquest and exploitation, and out of that you get slavery and taxes and forced labor and the division of labor, and then the gender divide between the division of labor and all these kinds of things. That seems to be the universal historical pattern. As the big question, I guess, for anarchists is is there some way around that? And if so, what kind of society would it take? For the example of the sewage treatment plant is interesting. I mean, like, apparently, according to Bob Black, the way we deal with that issue is we just have child labor. We just go back to the 19th century and reintroduce child labor and have children, working in sewers or something like that. So that's very anarchistic. But maybe some ANCAPs would approve of that, though. I don't know. But but I tend to take a somewhat more pragmatic, I would say maybe less utopian view of these kinds of things, and that I'm interested in looking at examples of societies from the past that existed for long periods of time, and for whatever flaws they had, they still managed to produce a lot of things of value. Like, I think Greece is one. I'm very interested in Greece. And the first response I often get to that is, but they had slavery, they had patriarchy, they had all kinds of awful things, but they also managed to function as a society that produced a whole lot of great stuff in terms of ideas and art and culture and that kind of stuff over a long period of time in a way that was durable. It doesn't necessarily mean we have to replicate the negatives. Another past civilization I'm interested in is actually the Holy Roman Empire, which actually existed for centuries. It was feudalism, and they had serfs, and they had bad things, they had religious wars, but they managed to, on one hand, avoid external conquest, and then have a huge diversity of local ethnic communities and folk communities and things like that for 1,000 years. And I've gotten a lot of brickbats thrown at me for this one, but I'm interested in the Ottoman Malay system, and the Ottoman culture. You actually had a high degree of autonomy for different religious communities with their own norms and customs and stuff like that. And of course, maybe Derrick could relate to this, but I'm also very interested in the indigenous cultures. If you go back and look at all of the many kinds of indigenous cultures around the world, you see that ways in which people manage to cooperate with each other without really formalized systems of statecraft of the kind that we're familiar with in modern societies. The question is, how extensive can that be in terms of population size? And also there's the big question of technology. I think technology is one of the big elephants in the room, because to what degree can you have technology without centralization, without concentrated power? And maybe Ted Kaczynski was right, maybe he wasn't. But I think that's something that needs to be thought more about as well.
All right, now Derrick, two things you have to tell me. You have to tell me the names of your two dogs. You gotta have the dogs on. And what's the animal on your sweater? Then you can have your final statement.
This is a kit box, and my mom died a year and a half ago, and she used to do needlepoint. And one of the things she did is she made me a whole bunch of these sweaters that she would take a regular sweater, and then she would count stitch the design onto it. And then the dogs I inherited her dogs when she died, and they're Shetland sheepdogs, and so she called them the Shetland. I think there are some islands in the Shetland Isles called Fair Isles, or maybe that's the name for the whole Shetland Islands, I don't know. And so she called the female Fairy and the male Eiley.
All right, so what are your final thoughts, Derrick?
Cat sitting on my lap, her name is Gray Kitty. That's just not as original. Well, I agreed with everything you said, and I thought it was really great. And I think for me, part of the problem is that I don't really care about anarchism. And by that I mean, I don't really care about, what I care about is what happens on the ground. I care about so I could walk into, if I were presented with how do we how do we work a sewage system for the city of New York that is as undestructive as possible, I would go in and I would try to create an effective system that, if I was tasked with this, that an effective system that was as unnasty as possible, I mean, I would still work with a hierarchy. Okay, so I had a conversation. I was doing a talk one time somewhere, and I was talking about Russian resistance to the Nazis in World War II during the talk, for whatever reason, I don't remember why. And this guy came up to me afterwards, and he said, no, there's never any call for, we always have to be able to act on our own at all times and make autonomous decisions for ourselves. And I said, that's all great, but I wouldn't be in a resistance movement with you. And he said, well, why not? And I said, look, if you, me, and someone else if we were in a real resistance movement against the Nazis in World War II, and if you, me, and my best friend were supposed to do an action, and you decided at the last minute, once we were there, that you didn't want to do it, and because of that my friend died, I would kill you. And he said, no, I get to choose at every moment what I do. And it's like, no, there are circumstances when you need to have follow through. And I'm not saying you kill somebody for not doing their job in the sewage treatment plant, but you could fire somebody, and you could say, look, the sewage ponds are overflowing. Go hit that button. And you need for them to actually go hit the button. You don't need for them to get into an argument with you. And so my point is, and I would be the person who would take orders too. I don't have a problem with hierarchy. Oh, here's a great story. When I was when somebody taught me how to hunt, and I was a terrible hunter, great hunter from the deer's perspective, but we would go out and we would ride in the car or in the truck out to go hunting, and we're all equal. The moment we get out of the truck and they hand me the gun, I do what they say, because they're experienced hunters and I'm not, and I don't know what the hell I'm doing. And also, the first thing he ever said to me when he handed me a gun is, if you take it from this side over to this side, you take it down, and if you ever once cross me with a gun, that means you take it and you point it at them when you're taking it across, he said, I will never take you hunting again. So the point is, there are circumstances for hierarchy and there are circumstances for not hierarchy. And I think, and I'm just a pragmatist on all that. And somehow I feel like that makes me a great anarchist, and somehow I feel like that makes me not an anarchist. You know, it's like, anyway, so those are my confusing final words.
All right. Well, thanks again, Keith Preston. Thanks again, Derrick Jensen. This is Todd Lewis of the Friends of Folly podcast signing off.